All right, guys. So this is the last part before we break into networking. I want to invite one by one three people who are looking at the ICO space from different angles. Um, First of all, I want to invite Stephanie Vaughan. She comes from New York, and she's been in various parts of Asia for the last few days. Really glad to have her. This is her first trip to India regarding the whole ICO space. And please, we'll be talking about what they're seeing in the market from a regulation perspective and valuation perspective. Second, Joel. Joel, most of you know. Joel spends most of his day looking at tokens and ICOs and can really be a good authority on valuation. And third, Shiv, who you just met. Shiv is the product head at Springrole. And among other things, they're developing the protocol, which we just heard about. And they're also starting the process for a token sale. And so they're also facing the same questions that we'll be talking about. So before anything else, Stephanie, why don't you tell us a little bit about BlockX, what you guys are currently focused on, to the extent you want to talk about some of the companies you're working with.
Sure. So I'm Stephanie Vaughan, and I work for BlockX Ventures, and we're an advisory and investor in different blockchain technologies. So we're located in New York and in Singapore. And for the last 3.5 weeks, I've been on a roadshow with 4 of our companies across Asia. So we started in Hong Kong, and then we went to Bangkok, they went to Vietnam, where else? Singapore, Beijing, Tokyo, and Seoul. And I got a chance to talk to all the different communities there, but also like see how these different technologies did through there. So we have 4 companies that we're advising. The first one is named Holic, and they're building the next 7 nanometer Bitcoin miner, and they have a utility token around skipping the line as far as future people that want to own that miner. There's a company called Ballyhoo, and their small business protocol. Another one called Autonomy, which is a protocol for self-driving cars. And the last one is Exchange, which is a use of putting digital advertising onto the blockchain and taking out the middlemen by using blockchain technology within digital advertising.
And Shiv, we already heard about Springrole, but Joel, if you want to talk about Outlier and what you guys are focused on nowadays.
Yeah, so Outlier Ventures is one of Europe's first angel investment fund focused on blockchains. We've since focused mostly towards what we call projects that have a convergence with IoT, AI, ML, and basically Industry 4.0 technologies using a blockchain aspect to it. Our most known portfolio companies probably IOTA. We have others in the works such as Evanim and Botanic. So that's what we do.
Awesome. Yeah, IOTA was a very small win, so tough times. Okay, so let's. So we, for those of you who were part of the last program, we've talked about generally the concept of ICOs versus VC funding, doing an ICO, etc. This panel is not about that. We're going to talk about the current market conditions the next 6 months. One thing that has come up in the last 1 month, I'd say a lot, and you guys know, if you heard me before, I love the concept of the ICO, not the current state of affairs. And so I'm actually happy that there is a lot of regulatory scrutiny for the right reasons. But Stephanie, maybe help us summarize, like, if you look at what's happening in the US, you were in Asia, right? How do you summarize what's going on regulatorily right now?
I'd say, everybody is getting harsher with regulations across the board. I'd say I feel like a lot of people from Asia are coming to the US to raise money, and a lot of people from the US are going to Asia, possibly because they don't understand specifically the regulations in each country. I'd say that people are still raising though, and there is still liquidity in this market, and it most likely is still easier to raise than raise from VCs. And I think when you're trying to get your technology funded, you're looking at the easiest way to raise, or your small business funded, or your startup funded, and there still is a lot of liquidity in the market in that way. I'd say, I mean, it's getting harsher as we go along. Every country is different. It's easier, for instance, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, and in Seoul than in other countries I talked about.
And specifically, if you talk about the US, right? Subpoenas and SEC regulations, Reg D, Reg S. Help us understand that stuff.
So specifically within the U.S., I guess about a little bit over a month ago, they came out with three different agencies came out with regulation. The first one being FinCEN, and then the second one being the Commodities Futures Commission, and then the last one being the SEC started sending out subpoenas. So you've heard that I know a lot of people personally that have gotten subpoenas for their blockchain company. But I think what most of the subpoenas did, unless the SEC believed that you were running a fraud, were just asking questions so that they could understand what the next steps are. I don't think the SEC at this point wants to say that every one of these tokens that has been issued is a security, even though they've alluded to the fact that they'll probably be securities going forward, but they don't want to cause a situation where everybody is sued in a class action lawsuit.
And what did you see in Asia last month?
As far as
It's regulatory, I mean, are people still investing from China? Or
people are still investing. China, I mean, people are more scared in China to invest, but small groups of investors are still investing. And I'd say in Hong Kong, there's a lot more investors. I know it's slightly different than China. I mean, there's still miners in China. So a lot of people think that, I'd say people are still investing everywhere.
So, and maybe this is a question for both of you. So Springrole is not doing an open crowd sale or anything of that sort right now, but you're obviously following what's happening. And tell us how you're adapting to this.
So yeah, so one thing is you have to constantly be looking for what is happening, right, and take cues from what the other people are doing. So because there's not a lot of laid down black and white regulations, it's a lot about just looking at what other people are doing, talking to the legal team, making sure you get a good understanding. And it's quite tempting because when you see a lot of people being reckless and sort of using tactics that you can get a lot of eyeballs and a lot of clicks with, but will probably somewhere down the line have issues. And the subpoenas are a good example of where you're seeing sort of the first stage of it coming back or sort of hitting you back for engaging in practices that might not be sort of very standard or that does not promote the investor's mindset. So from our company's perspective, it's all about making sure that the messaging, whatever we're writing in public boards, whatever we're writing on our websites, whatever we're talking to people, are all sort of consistent. Because especially from the SEC's perspective, they really want to safeguard the investors, and they don't want the investors to be misled into thinking that an investment in an ICO or in a token sale was marketed in a particular way and ended up in a different way.
So what specifically are you guys doing to make this compliant?
Right. So some of the basic things are, not screaming out, okay, buy whatever our token today and it's going to increase 2x in a month or so, or that, you can engage in sort of talking about it just from a investment perspective and not from a speculative or in the sense. And a lot of the idea of the utility token is centered around that, to make sure that, you're not talking about it as a profit-making investment, but more about as a way in which you can access the platform or access the app as a sort of a digital gatekeeper of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing. One of the first, SEC cases was they went after the Munchie. Yeah. I'm not sure if you discussed this last time, but the ICO, and that was specifically because they marketed it. It's not that it wasn't a utility token. It wasn't that they didn't have the Howey test done, but it was that they marketed it as you can make 10 times, or you can, if you purchase this, which is selling a security, you're selling an investment. And I think everybody would sort of want to look at if they, and in the future, I think token sales, when they do become securities in the US and when they're sold, is they'll be sold under Reg A Plus, which allows you, it's a US regulation that allows you to sell anything up to 50 million to the average American. And that means anybody who's just not accredited. And I think there's specific things under Reg A Plus that you have to work with the SEC so that you make sure that you're selling this investment. It's almost equivalent to, I guess, selling equity. But you have to file a 1K, you have to disclose your financials. So it's starting to do these things, I guess, preemptively, or just selling to Reg D in the US, which people are doing with their token sales.
Just one point that I wanted to mention is you talked about the Manchi, right? The Man token. So if you actually read the SEC's report, that they've actually gone into very specific things like what the CEO said in a particular podcast. That their Facebook post promoted a video that basically said that it's an investment. So they've been very specific. It's not. I guess there's a tendency to think that they're not looking at it as deeply as you'd want it to, but they definitely are, and they're really focusing on making sure that whatever communication the company gives or the project gives is sort of consistent and actually furthers the regulatory framework.
So clearly, communication is a big part of it, and don't say stuff like which is obvious nonsense. But when you guys are working on taking on new clients, and maybe perhaps there might be projects from India in the future as well. What's the general guideline? Like, do you tell them right now, don't bother with, seeking money from US investors, or do you tell them like, go figure out a Reg A plus or a Reg D? Do you usually just look at Asian markets as the way to raise money, or where are you?
Specifically, we're being extremely careful, especially since we are based in New York, and some of us have banking qualifications from before, so we don't want to get in trouble. Because it's also different when you're an advisor and you're an advisor to somebody who's selling something that could potentially be securities. You have to hit a higher bar. So most of the companies that we represent are companies that are based in Europe, and they're selling to the Asian market. And if they're US based, or if they are US company, they're now funding this project overseas, either in Singapore or in the Virgin Islands or something along those lines.
Any questions on the regulation part? Okay, there are 5, 6, 7. How about 2? Sunil and the gentleman in the white shirt. Sorry, we'll come to other questions perhaps in the networking session.
See, from a regulatory perspective, there are so many complexities which are yet to be decided. Let me take the case of the simplest one, that is whitelisting. In terms of whitelisting, is there any standard regulatory template which is common across all regulatory bodies across the world?
Whitelisting. If you're creating a whitelist of people who are interested, is there a standard template?
So, to be quite honest with you, I've studied whitelists a fair amount. From what I've noticed is teams have still been designing their whitelist to be inviting users of the product, not inviting investors per se. A good number of whitelists have been currently designed to attract users instead of investors. But during the peak that we saw in the last 2 quarters back, there were basically competitions for whitelists, like $1,000 minimums and things going on.
No, my question is not this. My question is that if we are expecting some sort of regulatory clarity, is this simplicity about whitelisting any single decision or single regulatory step which is moving towards the consensus on whitelisting? Is there any standard move? If they can't decide this simplest of step, can they decide other complex issues involved in ICUs?
All right, I think it's also a matter of the team's decision when it comes to whitelist and airdrops. There's no basic templates yet.
And especially if you look at the type of communication that the SEC has given, right? It's about the fact, in fact, they say that once you know that it's a security, there's a very well-established protocol in terms of what has to be done from a compliance perspective, your whole AML, KYC, investor protection, and all of those things. So I would actually take the counter to your question, which is that, once I feel like the confusion point right now is a lot of the ICOs and token sales trying to be a utility when they're actually a security. And that's where the heart of the conflict lies, because once it is deemed a security, there's a fairly robust from 1930s, 40s onwards process which has been evolving and sort of is fairly standard to go through. So.
Yeah, I think your question is about international cooperation, or are different countries' regulatory bodies working to come up with some common standards, with someone taking the lead on getting the consensus. I don't think that's happened at all when it comes to ICOs. I think you're seeing sort of crypto, right? The stance towards cryptocurrencies probably is one area where there is some with G20, etc. You're seeing some dialogue and consensus. I have not seen anything around ICOs.
I mean, I've gone to like a number of conferences recently, and this is the same thing has been brought up, that everybody needs to come together and create an agency so we can start to regulate ourselves, and perhaps that should be the first thing that's discussed. But yeah, I mean, there isn't any agency yet that's going to talk to all the regulators worldwide. But people have mentioned that we need to start one.
One more question, and then we'll move on to. I guess so.
All right. So my question is to Stephanie. I'm a lawyer and a policy analyst, and the question is, I deal with the government quite often, and one thing I've realized is the understanding of the technology of the ICO has been fairly limited, and even the people who take the decisions within the government don't have complete understanding of how the technology works. Now, in the United States, where the regulations have been quite mature and at least there's some progress in terms of regulations, I wanted to understand how much of these regulations have been participatory and discussed and been processed after discussions with ICOs who've raised money through it. Has it been a single initiative of the government themselves, or has it been a process where the ICOs have been an integral part on deciding what these regulations are? Because in India, as it seems, at least at the federal level, you see them taking decisions in silos without it being participatory. So therefore, I want to understand, at least from the United States example, probably for us to push it here, have they been an integral part, the ICOs individually, or have the government understanding of technology so nuanced that they were able to do it themselves?
I mean, I would say, are you asking like how the SEC specifically has been just kind of working with different ICOs talking? I think that's part of what the subpoenas were. I think they were trying to gather information, but, and I guess I also want to make a disclaimer that nothing I'm saying here is any advice, but, and then this is just an opinion on the SEC, but the SEC, and I was a prior Marine before this, so I've worked in the government, and I realized like how a bureaucracy works. But people in the SEC and the SEC as an agency isn't necessarily driven by. It could be driven by different things, different people with different personalities trying to get. Try to be the lawyer within the SEC that defines something on the ICO. So it makes it more difficult for them to kind of control what regulation might come out. And then there's different agencies, as everybody's seen, besides the SEC, that want to come out and regulate and be that person that says something about what the ICO is or what crypto is. So it's hard to say because it's not necessarily driven like by any competitive market what the government will do as far as regulation.
Yeah. I don't know much about the SEC, but I often think of it as more reactive and punitive. And when these policies are made, you let things go wrong, and then you're like, okay, how do we rein it back?
Reactionary, you mean?
It's reactionary. I can't think of many enforcement agencies like the SEC or the SEBI in India. It's usually not a participatory process to begin with, right?
I mean, you might be surprised, but a lot of other regulations in India, say dealing with non-tech, have all been participatory at the pre-stage. So I'm be surprised to see, especially when it's new tech that's involved, the government doesn't do participatory regulations. So maybe that's something we need to change on a larger...
One thing I guess you can look at what the SEC's done is, if you look at crowdfunding, kind of ICO aside, crowdfunding in the US during the last administration was seen to have like fallen behind Europe and really fallen behind as a vehicle that could be used for companies to raise money. And then they came up with a new Jobs Act, and they have Reg A plus. And I think this administration initially was going to, put in charge Clayton within the SEC, and he was going to kind of come up with policies that were going to even make crowdfunding easier for everybody. Because in reality, you had to spend about $500,000 in 6 months with the SEC in order to get something approved so that you could go out and then raise that $50 million. And I don't think that's what anybody thought that the Jobs Act would accomplish when it was passed. But so I think in that way that this SEC was going to look at that, but then the ICO sort of bypassed everything, and then people started running scams, and they have to make sure that they protect the Americans. So I think that's how it sort of played out, yet alone, I mean, that's not really a great answer, but generally they're more reactive.
Great. Moving on to the second topic, which is token valuation. Now, we could spend a month talking about this stuff, right? A lot of the times I keep hearing, oh, this token is overvalued or undervalued. And, I studied finance, and I understand traditional finance ways of value. And this is completely different in a way, because none of those rules seem to apply. So Joel, when do you think a token is undervalued or overvalued? How do you even think about valuing a token?
Okay, so this really depends on the kind of token that we're looking at. There would be different lens through which I would look at a token, depending on whether it's a utility token or if it's a base layer token like Ethereum that creates mechanisms for more apps to be built on top of it. So, for instance, the other day we were talking about Civic. So Civic's valuation a few days back was $68 million. So in that case, I was basically just comparing it with a traditional equity startup and how much would a network combining of AML KYC details from around the globe, a startup that has active interactions with present-day enterprises, be valued at. So yes, there is a certain amount of premium, and yes, there would be a certain amount of error involved, but you could come to an estimate as to what a utility token is worth, depending on the addressable market and the percentage share it has, just like you do it with your traditional equity models. Now, when it comes to the protocol layers like Ethereum or any of the more open network-based tokens, it's more confusing because there's no easy way to pinpoint and say this is what this network is worth. For instance, if you look at the market as a whole, the market cap of all cryptocurrencies has swayed from about 0.600 billion to a low of roughly about 280 to 300 billion in the last couple months, right? So the market caps largely sway, and in those cases, what one tends to do is look at the developer community around it. So if you heard Sumuk speak, he consistently mentioned there is a strong developer community around Ethereum. What that basically means is that there is a large number of apps being built on top of it. There is consistent innovation and development happening with that particular protocol. So you have to account for that and give it a particular amount of premium. You also have to account for the number of industries the protocol that you're talking about might affect. So if you're talking about IOTA, maybe the possible market size might be relatively small when compared to something like Ethereum, which has multiple industries it would affect over time. So I would say for utility tokens, it's more relatively somewhat similar to what you would do with your equity investments. It's somewhat comparable. But if you're talking protocol tokens, then that's very murky waters. I can't pinpoint and say this is how we do it.
Right, so pure security tokens doesn't matter. It's just like any other equity or dividend generating instrument. So utility tokens, it's almost like you're saying, look at comparables in the equity world and look at what their value is and just kind of make a guess. But so it isn't actually bottom up, or so even a fund like yours, one of the most sophisticated ones, you're not actually at the stage of applying any pricing models or thinking of like ether as oil. And the whole crypto assets book, right? All of the fundamental valuation models that you can apply. Do you guys do any of that?
To be quite honest, we do have collaborations with the Imperial College Economics Department. We have an internal token economics team. We have valuation models, but from my understanding of the industry at large and what I've seen internally, I can tell you that it's not precise yet. It's not grown to a point where you can pinpoint and say this is how it does. Now, for anyone that's looking to understand the matter more, you can look up Chris Berniski's basic model that's there. And that is his book too. So if you go through the two, you pretty much, as a retail investor, you have what you need to do investments in the space.
Okay, so Civic, you look at other startups that are in the similar space, and you just think of the scale of usage, etc., and compare. Okay, I mean, I guess that's the best you can do at this point. So now, when you guys, both of you, right, you're working with startups at the earlier stages when you're trying to structure the token economics of an ICO. How do you decide how to price a token at that point?
Well, I'd say, I mean, one thing that we do, which is much to do with value, but we suggest that people start their token, each token be worth a cent versus worth $1, even if you end at the same number.
That's just psychology.
Yes, just because of psychology, because people think if they buy something at a cent and it grows 10 times, it's a lot better than if it grows to $10 from $1. So I mean, that's the advice that we give people. And I'd say also kind of as all of our companies go on this roadshow, and then, as they'll go along through their ICO, they'll change their token value, like sort of like a startup, and they'll change their token economics slightly and the amount that they're giving out, like sort of like as a startup goes on a roadshow to meet a bunch of different VCs, they may want to start and raise 10 million on a 60 million pre-money, but end up raising 10 million on a 30 million. So, or vice versa.
And especially when you think of companies that are thinking of tokens, right? So at least one of the things that we did is just sort of look at what the end goal will look like, and sort of just map out and make sure, because it is a one-time activity, right? Once you've set that number in your smart contract, you can't change it. You can probably just make it more fractional. And at least at Springrole, we wanted to keep it at whole numbers. So that sort of gave us a rough ballpark. Okay, say, if your end product has these many users and these are the number of actions that they're going to perform on average on their lifetime, that multiplied with the, is sort of one approximate way in which at least you can start off thinking about it. But I completely take both these people's points in account, that there is a lot of arbitrary assigning, because it's very difficult to predict what will happen in the future. It's very difficult to predict how your network will grow. So there's a lot of variables involved, and it's also quite reactive in terms of when you start talking to people and investors, then you kind of figure out and you get a lot more clarity then as well.
Yeah, I think if people get a lot more clarity through their pre-sale.
So is that it essentially? Like that's when you revise, right? After that, because you probably start with, I don't know, 100 million tokens, $1 each. You just tell yourself, I'm going to be worth 100 million. Well, what stops you from saying, I have 200 million tokens, $1 each, I should be worth 200 million? Like, are companies, like to what Joel's point was earlier, like, do you try to benchmark? You can look at the top 100 crypto or top 200 cryptocurrencies right now. And is that something you can do, is look at, okay, if we succeed in what we are doing, we should be in the top 100 coins. And that's one more marker to say what kind of value you should expect.
I mean, I honestly think, like any startup that goes on a roadshow, that it just is way too early to tell. It's very early stage, and they change it. I'd say they start, at a cent, not at $1, but and then test the market, and then some realize they can raise a lot more money, like Telegram, than they initially thought. So we'll just change along the way.
Yeah, and I think not a lot of companies change the actual token supply when they start talking, but it probably... I mean, of course, there will be cases, but typically what they sort of more change is sort of get a better idea of what is the discount or what is sort of the rate at which people seem to be evaluating your company, and that sort of forms, and that's where people like Joel also come in when they look at it objectively with sort of their experience in doing these type of things. So that gives you a good indication. So the number, at least from what I have seen, the total supply numbers don't change, but sort of the base, what you pick it out at, that does change. And sort of from a company or from a company that's building a product, one other way to look at it is sort of just focus on the product. The your evaluation or your market cap should accurately reflect that, if you're true or if you're sort of go out and do what you wanted to do. So.
Got it. I have one last topic, but before that, one question on this topic, if anybody. Yeah, Rajesh.
So the utility perspective, utility tokens are always an issue in terms of how can you look at the value of a token. It's a utility token. Because I would presume that instead of looking at the value of a token, you basically have to look at the valuation of the company. So because the utility token is trying to drive a business, it's not a business in itself, right? So you got to look at it from the perspective of valuation of the business, which is being driven by a token, and how fast can you beat competition using that token, and can you then bring that into the valuation of the company rather than looking at the valuation value of the token in itself. Right? So that is the way that I look at it, because any utility token is basically to raise money and then to drive your business, and it's not an end in itself.
So would you suggest that a Springrole, which is, I don't want to call it LinkedIn on blockchain because that's too cliched and not really accurate, but if you use that, would you suggest to them that you look at LinkedIn's valuation and then
you look at LinkedIn's valuation, obviously, but then you got to discount for the fact that you're starting out.
Of course.
Take those kind of discounts, but then you look at it from the perspective how far, what is in 3 years' time or in 5 years' time, what would be the value of the company, given that the token can be an accelerator for your business. So you look at the valuation of the company because the token itself is just a facilitator of the business and not the business itself. So that's where I struggle to understand.
That's what I was also hinting at, and I think
I struggle to understand when people say value of the company based on its tokens. It's not value of the company based on the tokens. Value of the company based on its business, which is driven by a token.
No, that's fine. But at the end of the day, the math computes to roughly the same, right? So I think we're all saying the same thing, which is that there's a top-down way of looking at it. There's a bottom-up way of looking at it. It's really still immature. You're starting to see some interesting arguments around comparisons, but it's arbitrary. It's completely arbitrary. You guys want to add something to that?
Yeah, just one point, which is that I think there's a fair amount of misnomer in terms of utility token, right? I mean, almost every company or every they're doing a token sale wants to call themselves a utility token, and I think this is where sort of it's sometimes good to listen to the regulators and just to hear what they think about it. Where I think the SEC's come out very clearly and said that almost every utility token will be classified as a security token. So that kind of answers your question that it actually does get linked to the company's success or how the company is going to do ahead, even though on their website they might say, okay, we've not passed the Howey test and hence we are a pure utility token. So that sort of ties it up to the company's thing a lot more clearly. So.
Okay, so last thing, next 6 months, right? What's going on? What's going to happen?
I'll go last. Oh, okay. I'd say the next 6 months, I think the price will, I think it'll stay kind of where it is right now, and then hopefully in a couple months start to grow a little bit. I don't think it'll jump back up. I don't think we're going to see anything huge this whole year as far as price changing, and I think people are now going to start to focus on the technology. But as far as the ICO market, I still think people will raise with ICOs and they'll find liquidity in this market, and it still is a good way to raise and acquire customers, and it still will be better than traditional fundraising.
Yeah, I think next 6 months, a lot of focus on probably the first set of ICOs delivering their products and sort of putting something out there that people can actually evaluate, because there's been a long period, and that combined with sort of the regulatory compliances that are coming in, I think will also pressure people to sort of start delivering and sort of not, vacation in Cayman Islands after you raised or something like that. So.
I think in the general markets, retail investors would be more skeptical, and scared than ever before, especially with, for instance, the RBI notice coming out yesterday. So there's going to be a general lack of clarity amongst retail investors. But to be honest, if you look at what's going on with enterprises and if you look at what's going on with institutional funds, there are reasons to be bullish. Enterprises, at least some, have started looking at investing directly at the token level. So, for instance, Lufthansa Airlines has uh, made a similar move. And on the institutional side, for instance, just yesterday I read about George Soros's fund possibly entering the token markets. So there is, I wouldn't call it smart money, but there is big money, at least on the sidelines, waiting to enter the ecosystem. But like both of them mentioned, because there is general fear in the markets, we might see a period of flat lines going on. But again, studying ICO trends, what I've learned is that we would continue seeing larger rounds, we would continue seeing large races, but most of them fueled by institutional investors. We will see more investment rounds coming in the 25 to $50 million range, but a good number of them would have staffs filling up the amounts instead of the money coming in from public markets anymore. So ICOs would eventually reach a point where I don't believe they would replace VC. I don't believe they would replace IPOs either. They would basically be between an between your late series C, D rounds and an IPO. But whether a company that has done an ICO can eventually IPO is probably a big question mark for much later.
What you said is interesting, and I think that's likely, but it's also exactly the opposite of what ICOs were supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about the token user being a buyer of your token and creating the network effect. So this just means tokens replace equity, and the large VC funds and the large crypto funds play in this game. Would you agree with that?
I don't know. I think that I could still see the SEC working, and it could work as a Reg A in order for just anyone to buy this. I don't see institutional investors coming in at this point or this year, especially in the next 6 months after what just happened. And I see it as more of a Series A or a Series B, not a Series C or D.
I think what you mentioned about Series B is accurate. 25 to 50 probably comes around there. Regarding institutional investors, when I said institutional, I think I had to clarify that these would be specifically hedge funds that are looking for trade opportunities, and not your pension funds and sovereign funds and the guys that trade relatively safe, right? Also, I think the big innovation for me when it comes to ICOs is that it provides a way for network participants to have a stake in the value that's generated in that network. So if that is happening, be it Springrole or Facebook or LinkedIn, then the objective is, in my opinion, done. Like, do retail investors have the appetite to keep pumping billions of dollars into this ecosystem? I would say no. At some point in time, the big players have to come in and step in. That's happened with even Web 2.0 companies. Facebook eventually had much larger rounds. We saw the same happen with Uber. So eventually, the big players have to come in and take deep financial positions in each of these companies. But as long as value share is happening between network participants and the owners of the network itself, then the end goal is done.
So, in your world, it's similar to the public markets. VCs are the funds fund a company, it goes public, and then the retail investor gets to participate in the next innings of growth. And you're saying in a compressed timeline, you see the token market playing out like that, where a lot of the large token ICOs will be led by the institutions, and then retail people will buy them on exchanges later on. And so, okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I hope that we can find a middle point somewhere, because the promise of getting the early developers invested in the protocols, getting the users crowdfund this ICO was very powerful, and I say that even as someone who was in VC, I think it needs to be a standalone option versus VC, not just go down that track. But fair points. Would you like to say?
I guess one other point, I think once they do come out with a security token, it will allow a lot of, and if they can sell it to people that aren't just Reg D, but to Reg A and to sell it to anybody, you might not be collecting the 10 or 20 times that you get, but it will allow people to invest in things where they might get 13% or 6%, which is more that they're making in their bank accounts right now. So I don't think we're really going to know what's going to happen with that.
Yeah, and I think Joel's point has a fair amount of weightage because at Springrole we've been tracking how these ICOs have been performing, right? So just getting numbers on Telegram or your mailing list haven't translated to public sales raising a lot of money. So that gap actually does get filled in by especially I think the ones who are leading it are these blockchain funds, basically people who've done VCs and now they have a pure blockchain wing to it that only does ICOs or token sales. So I think although it was created to allow public participation and for the network effect, what's happening, at least from a statistics or from what the market is showing right now, is like 80% of it as actually coming from those traditional players, and 20% or maybe even lesser is the one that gets funded from your public sale. So
I'll just give you one data point that I've been tracking recently, and maybe you could confirm it. When you said ICOs would replace VCs, that was possible until late 2016, 2017, when it was about the community, the people that were building on it, right? And then it became about Telegram ads, it became about Twitter ads, and all those ads. And the latest figure, and I'm not sure about this, is ICOs spent anywhere between $100,000 to $500,000, and in some cases it goes much, much higher, just on their fundraise. So if you're talking seed rounds in India, it ranges anywhere between 30 to 150K from what I've observed. So in order to get the initial 500K, a lot of entrepreneurs might want to go and take money from friends and family. But even then, they would want a VC on board just for the brand name. So if you study some of the latest ICOs that have gone on to raise ridiculous amounts, you would see a lot of brand name VCs on board, right? So one more aspect that I would say traditional players bring in is expertise. You can raise funds from a crowd, yes, you should, but if they cannot give you the expertise and leadership your token eventually needs, then that's a gap. So it's also a little bit about governance, and you can look at it from a proof of stake perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are some very interesting and different points. I think the biggest thing that I think is going to be the next big trend is a lot of people have started working on just security ICOs being done in a compliant and easy way, which would open floodgates, because then you don't need to have this debate about utility of tokens, and you just have a very easy way to crowdfund essentially, and so again for equity or some token that's linked to equity or dividends. And I think to Joel's point, it's true, right? You've kind of have the pendulum is now swung the other way, and unfortunate, I think that well, a lot of my friends in VCs will keep their jobs for many years to come, but unfortunate that that because of what we've seen in the last 12 months or so, it won't be a standalone mechanism. It seems to be a lot of different stages. Either right to get started, they will need seed funding, or just to pay for the cost of the ICO, they might need some source of funding, or they might just see the benefit of only doing a pre-sale, not doing a crowd sale, and then the community participation comes at a later stage. Anyway, lots more to talk about, but no more time. So one or two questions, and then we'll break. Aheli?
Yeah. So my question is, am I audible?
To us, you are. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my question was to Stephanie that the thing is that recently I came across this news that Polynex, the exchange, was acquired by Circle, which is quite influential. Which will, probably help them sort out their financial issues. Polynex, I mean, and there was this agreement that was between these two, and and a journalist from New York Times got his hands on the agreement, which was supposed to be confidential, and they said that the SEC would not be bothering Circle slash Polynex regarding their regulations, because certain people in the in the company are know the people in SEC really well. So that I feel kind of brings a light on exactly how impartial SECs are, as a regulatory body. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
I mean, I'm on how impartial. I mean, I think honestly, the SEC, you don't.
You worked with
I
the
think
government.
the SEC, I think that right now, like I said before, they make decisions like if any bureaucracy makes a decision. So different people do have different relationships. For instance, there's one company, T0, they're raising an ICO. They're building an exchange, but they've been talking to the SEC, and their lawyers have been speaking to the SEC since 2014. So they formed a good relationship. Some take that approach. So you really don't, I guess, you don't know what specific people in the SEC are going to do unless you set out to do something that's a fraud. Then I think that they will come after your company.
Okay. Hey, Raj. Yeah.
Some 3-4 days back, I had the good fortune of having a call with Catherine Nug, who is the marketing VP of Coin and Liquid, and she was telling me like how Constamp made their entire money through an organic ICO, through this concept called the proof of caring. Now she was saying that she would incorporate and start educating ICO investors into like learning how to do a more organic ICO. Do you think that is valuable in India, where we can like educate people how to do that?
So I think something similar happened with proof of love with Mobius too, right? So that comes back to our whitelisting discussion. So just to give background to others, so in a proof of love whitelisting, what people do is they basically either talk about the product or they use the product themselves and share it with their friends. And according to the number of users, they basically get access to the whitelist. I feel and this has actually happened. I asked an entrepreneur in India, why did you go about with the token sale? And he said that VC backing was limited. If Indian startups can position their tokens to a point where they can find massive adopters without having to spend heavily on marketing, then they definitely should. And I think that's one of the things Springrole is, I would say, doing brilliantly. They're finding adopters without spending heavily on marketing. So I think whitelisting and airdrops is innovative. I'm not talking from a regulatory point of view. I'm talking from a user adoption point of view. It's very innovative, and if you can get people to use your network, sure, that's definitely.
Do you say proof of love? Is that what it's called? They actually call that? That's really interesting. All right. Well, this was our proof of love for you guys.